Thank you. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone from all around the world. I'm Chris PERCY. I'm a researcher based in London looking at career transitions, unsurprisingly, education outcomes. And I'll present today some work done together with Ingrid Schoon, who's the Professor of Human Development and Social Policy at UCL in London. And I'll whiz us through the slides and then Ingrid will join us for the Q&A at the end. So this topic is one of the 14 indicators, basically, that the OECD has been looking at. And for those of you who joined the plenary session yesterday or looked at the working paper which Catalina lead authored that was published just yesterday, you'll be very familiar with these sort of 14 indicators. And one of them is called a sort of career originality or career concentration. And this is basically the idea of having ideas at a relatively young adolescent or mid-adolescent age, which are similar to those of your peers, and trying to understand what that means. And we'll be presenting today the results on a sort of new data set that can be added to the ones that have been included in that working paper already. We're particularly keen to look at this because it's an indicator that is sort of it's kind of got a bit of a question mark next to it. It's kind of described, it was described yesterday as a tantalizing indicator because it sort of it nearly works, but there isn't quite as much evidence as Catalina and colleagues would like to properly bring it into the fold of a sort of kind of OECD stamped. Yes, we kind of recommend that schools and policymakers use this as an indicator of successful school to work, of successful future school to work transitions for youngish teenagers. And I'll come on to the reasons why in a moment, but we're very happy to be adding a bit more evidence to that topic. Let me tell you a bit about what we mean specifically here. So that there's this common job aspiration, all sorts of different ways of measuring it. We've chosen a way that is in line with how the PISA dataset analysis is done with the rest of the OECD. And it's basically saying, if you ask someone, what job do you want to do? And we code that as detailed as we can, in this case with 4-digit sort of standard occupational coding is what it is in the UK, but relatively detailed, it would differentiate different types of nurse, for instance. Is the one that you pick in the top 10 for someone of your age and gender? So it's a very broadly defined peer group. It's not a peer group specific to your school, but it's in general for your age and gender. Is this in the top 10? And you tend to find that about 50% of people do pick a job that is in their top 10. It varies a bit from country to country. I'll touch on that in a moment as well. And we found it was about 40 to 50% in our group as well. So it's a lot of young people who are picking something in the top 10, despite the fact there are obviously hundreds of jobs coded at that level. Now, we know that aspirations in general are interesting and important. We know that kind of having high versus low aspirations predicts all sorts of things we might be interested in about future outcomes and shaped by all sorts of things. We know a bit less about this common aspiration, but we've got reasons to believe that if you don't have an original career idea, or if you do have a concentrated career idea, a common aspiration, it might be disadvantageous for some students. And the reason is because they might be following the crowd. They might just be picking a job idea that lots of people are talking about, sounds fun. They might have absorbed some ideas from social media, from society around them that says, this is a common idea for people, of your gender, of your age. This is a common sort of idea. So they might have adopted it with relatively little thought and relatively little guidance or challenge. That in itself might not be so bad, but if that then drives poor pathway decision-making or just not taking the time to explore other options, that's when you might start to expect negative outcomes. It's an interesting topic in all sorts of countries. England is certainly an interesting context because there's such a strong disconnect between the jobs that young people say they want to do and the jobs that ultimately are available in the economy. So at some point, as they make that transition from school to work, something has to give. There's an unpleasant and often unpleasant adjustment period. So that's what we're talking about. If this can be shown to be important, then it can inform practice. It gives a new thing to ask young people for a start, and a new thing for guidance practitioners to actively work on. What job are you looking at? Let's do a cross-check against whether it is one of those sort of gender stereotypical or common ones. If it is, incorporate additional challenge and support. Help think about backup plans. So it's a tweak on existing practice. It wouldn't overhaul existing practice, but it is potentially influential if we can demonstrate it. And this is the reason it's a bit tantalizing at the moment. The OECD evidence so far sort of suggests that most of the time it doesn't make a big difference, but for some subgroups, it typically has an adverse relationship with earnings. Yesterday, some new research was just published that showed in Canada, there actually was a positive relationship with earnings. So you might have, we've got three here that point in a negative direction, one that points in a positive direction. So it seems to be highly contextual, which is probably a sign that you wouldn't want to impose this too strongly in any one setting. Whatever we might learn from England that we'll present today, you would probably always want to take a very nuanced and sensitive, person-specific interpretation of this indicator. But nonetheless, tantalizing. It seems to be adverse in some cases. So where we've come in is sort of adding a bit more evidence into this picture. So we're asking ourselves, what is the association between these kind of top 10 job choices and an income measure of attainment? So something that's got all the flaws of how the labour market is structured, but is nonetheless objective and that you can't change it in a survey. And then our second question is, how does it relate to a subjective evaluation of one's life? So this is sort of the life satisfaction measure. And there's a bit less evidence on this. And there's every reason to believe from theory that it could go one way or the other. Like if you've got a good idea what job you want to do from a young age, you might have what's described as an achieved identity. You've got a sort of a slightly stronger sense of self in the way you fit, which may well correlate with being more satisfied both now and in the future. The other side of the picture is early foreclosure. And this kind of, where you make the decision a bit too early and you don't consider other options. This split between flexibility and foreclosure came up a lot in the plenary session, the plenary panel discussion yesterday. So it's very live in how kind of leading thinkers construct this idea of career guidance and young people's decision-making. We're particularly interested in whether we can relate this to the number of job ideas young people are talking about. And we would hypothesize that if you've only got one idea, you're at greater risk of, if that idea is common, gender stereotypical, you're at greater risk of adverse outcomes. You've heard me mention gender several times there. We want to look at this split explicitly by gender, not least because transitions through and into work can be different, peer groups are different, we know the aspirations are different, you're about to see that on a slide. So everything we've done in this, we've split by gender. I should caveat there, really, because of the size of the sample, which is pretty good, but not big enough. When I'm saying gender here, what we're really talking about is the interviewer coding of the interviewee's sex. So forgive me for that being sort of slightly coarse phrasing. Really what we're talking here about is the observed sex as specified by the interviewer. Right, let me go on. So the data is longitudinal study, government backed in England. First interviewed early teenage years, we've got outcomes at age 25. The key questions we've got, well, they were asked very bluntly, do you have any ideas what job you want to do? If they said yes, we asked what job it was. They didn't have to give two answers, or none, or one. They could give as many as they wanted. Most gave a single answer, but some gave more. And that's where we've got this idea of people exploring multiple jobs. Whether it was a common career choice, as we said, is in the top 10 by this 4-digit coding, 01. Career flexibility, did they list more than one job aspiration? And those early career outcomes were measured at age 25. A bit more detail there on how they're measured for those interested. If there are questions, I can go more into the control variables. All I want to say for now is it's a good data set, and we've been able to capture a range of the things that are typically understood to influence career pathways, at least as far as they can be measured. So backgrounds, socioeconomic status, behaviors, plans for the future, how people think about themselves as sort of high academic achievers or low academic achievers, indeed how far they progress through study, whether they go to university, demographics, location, and their family structure. So a good set of things, but of course, you never quite capture everything you'd be interested in. So career aspirations, the number, so this is about the number of jobs that people proactively stated at age 13, 14. Obviously, if they said none, we've counted that as no idea. They've explicitly got no idea. If they said they weren't sure how many ideas they had, we kept them out. We excluded them from the sample for this particular analysis. But you could explore whether they should go in as a 0.5 or a 0. But for now, we kept them out just because of the ambiguity. I mentioned already that if you say one job, there's this sort of ambiguity about whether it's positive or negative. The same is also true if you start to list 2 or 3 or more. Like on the one hand, the positive interpretation is you're exploring lots of options. That's good. On the other hand, you don't really know what the right number of options to be explored would be, which is probably also not quite the right way of phrasing it. There would be, the right number depends on the person and where they are and how they're feeling and what they're doing. So we've got quite a blunt question, but the acknowledgement is just that almost any level of answers that somebody gives, it could be negative or positive. So we know that the average statistics that we'll be putting out here are not going to be determinative for all young people. There are for sure going to be some that this is positive, some that it's negative, some that it makes no difference at all. It's just not pertinent. So we're interested in where that average falls. When we looked at you can see the differences between men and women there. They're not large. They do come out as statistically significant. So on average, young men are at this age more uncertain than young women. Let's look at what some of those jobs are, actually. And these, as I think you've heard earlier on, the slides will be shared and recordings will be coming out in a few weeks. So I won't go through every line of this. Looking at the young men to start off with, I mean, the first thing to highlight, on the left-hand side, you've got what they thought they might be interested in doing. 40% said something in the top 10 for their gender. And at age 25, people are much more spread out. The top 10 only accounts for 17%. And this is kind of the point. Yeah, aspirations are so narrow at this age. So almost any kind of spreading them out is probably a good thing. There's not a lot in common between what people said they would do and what they ended up doing. If you take a slightly broader definition than 4-digit coding, you say 3-digit coding. So we've still got 100 or so options. About 10% of people, both men and women, not a big difference by gender, end up broadly at age 25 in sort of the same occupational area as they said at age 30. In other words, the vast majority do not. The color coding here are ones that are maybe thematically linked a bit. So, okay, computer engineering isn't exactly the same as programming, but you can see a thematic connection. So there's not a lot of thematic connection going here. And I don't need to draw out the gender stereotypes. I'm sure that will be clear to everyone on the call. Women, first thing to point out is it's higher levels of concentration, which is in line with what the OECD and other studies have found. Nearer to 50% of young women are picking one of the top 10 jobs also picked by young women. On the other hand, there's sort of a bit more thematic crossover. These pinks, sort of caring professions, there's quite a lot of that is transitioning, at least in a broad sectoral sense. Teaching, yes, we can see teaching in a broad sense coming across, but lots and lots of this not being pursued. So let's go on to sort of what we learned from the analysis. So grayed out means it's not statistically significant at the 15% level. And we'll see on the next slide, often there are some insights in something that was significant that became insignificant, which can be interesting. But for men, whether or not they've got a common career aspiration isn't making a lot of difference. Doesn't make a lot of difference for either their income or their self-reported job satisfaction. It's directionally negative, but let's not read too much into it. It's got a it's very inconsistent as a finding. What was significant is whether the young men are thinking about more jobs. If they list more jobs, they were more likely to be earning more money. And this is statistically significant at the 15% level and quite close to the 10% level. With young women, kind of motivating the case or defending the case for looking at the two gender, the sort of the two sex identifications separately, we see quite a different pattern. So for young women, where they had this common career aspiration, where they failed to have career originality, as the indicator is currently phrased, there is a statistically significant negative wage association with those controls in place. So not strongly causal, but with strong reason to believe it, given the nature of the analysis. That negative relationship sort of disappears if they actually get into the broad area, which is interesting. And it also largely disappears and turns insignificant if the young women were stating more than one job. So there's some sense that having backup plans and explorations offers some protection, not full protection, but offers some protection against this kind of career concentration adverse indicator. But this is where it gets really interesting. It's actually positive for life satisfaction. So it's negative for earnings, but positive for satisfaction until you get it. If you actually broadly achieve that job, you move in the same sort of area, the wage disadvantage disappears, but the satisfaction advantage, to the extent that it means something, that disappears, and if anything turns negative, turns directionally negative. Number of job ideas, a bit like with young men, this is statistically significant and positive, as long as it's not too many. With men, there was no such thing. Kind of the more the better. Within reason, we only really got up to 4 or 5 in this data set. But for young women, as soon as they were getting up to 4 or more, it was really sort of turning negative. So 2 or 3 was more beneficial than 0 or 1. So
Hi, Chris, you have 3 minutes. I don't want to interrupt you before.
3 minutes. Yeah, understood. So this is the summary, and this really just puts in text what I've been reading out on the previous slides. So I don't want to go into this. This is just giving the narrative overview of what was in the numbers that I spoke through as we went. What I'd rather spend the last 2 minutes on is thinking about the interpretation and what it might mean. So there's a mixture of high and low ambitions in both. We're not seeing strong things there. It's out of sync with demand. Both of them have got a high concentration, but even higher for women. There is this wage disadvantage associated with career concentration for women, no benefits for men. So again, this is picking up this sort of tantalizing, some subgroups it's bad, but we can't say a strong story that is true for lots of people. Most people don't end up doing what they said they were going to do. Kind of interesting. Backup job ideas, generally positive, with the caveat that these are blunt instruments. So what might that mean? So that's kind of the interpretation of the data. What does this actually mean for practice? Well, there's a lot of this that's already in sync with good practice. You'll struggle to find careers advisors, particularly at age 13, 14, that were not encouraging awareness and exploration of diverse careers. Many of them would want to start early. This certainly supports the case that you'd want to start well before 13, 14, because that's when the career concentration is already so strong, the narrowness is already so strong, the gender stereotyping is already so clear. So that's in sync with good practice. It puts some weight into some additional emphases. It argues that it is worthwhile recording and tracking these job aspirations that young people have got. And let's not just ask them, let's also record them, because then we can analyze them in aggregate across schools, across local authorities, and so on. Use those to inform conversations. And in conversations, be mindful about whether these are gender stereotypes or in areas where aspirations far outweigh demands. And they are common choices, which isn't to push people away from them. There are plenty of people who they want to be teachers, they become teachers, that's wonderful. But what is beneficial is to encourage backups and an open mind and to maintain some sense of exploration. And to do this a bit more deliberately, I think this is fundamentally good practice, but you can do it a bit more deliberately. You can defend the argument for being a bit more deliberate about it because of the strength of this indicator, even though it's still a bit tantalizing and the evidence is a bit mixed. In program design, it would argue for putting more work into the reality of these oversupplied, these common jobs. Because if people get those jobs or move in those directions, they didn't seem to be too happy with it. Satisfaction was dropping, the wage sort of disadvantage was disappearing, but it was a disadvantage disappearing rather than a benefit coming in. So we're not too excited by that. People are pursuing perhaps high prestige jobs. We saw there were lots of lawyers and solicitors on that previous slide and lots of IT work. So quite high income jobs. maybe they get into it, the income is good, but the life satisfaction, it's the early stages of that career isn't what they thought it would be. So providing insight into the challenges of those careers, the early, what it's like to do the first few years of those careers is something that could be targeted in program design. So let me stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.